everybody, Trevor here, and welcome to another Top 5 video. Last time, we talked about my picks for Duncan's voice actor, and today, we'll be discussing my top 5 favorite episodes starring Duncan. I've already talked about Duncan's character in the last video, so to not sound like a broken record, let's just get this video started right away. Coming at number 5 is Duncan in the Hot Air Balloon. This is an episode of Season 12, which was a transition season from the Marqel era to the CGI series. It is about Duncan, who was tasked to take the red balloon to the Percival twins' birthday party, but Duncan wanted to give them a ride, not the balloon. When it comes to Michael Brandon's impression of the Duncan character, this one would probably be his best effort because of the CGI transition. I mean, it's still not perfect, but at least he did his best at the time. However, my only gripe with this episode is that why did they have to have the red balloon on a flatbed while being filled with hot air? Wouldn't it float away along with the flatbed? Yeah, you can see why this is so low on the list. However, I chose this as number 5 because it shows that Duncan is not only a grumpy engine, but can also care for others, especially with the Percival twins. He was basically trying to give them their birthday treat only to ruin the balloon. So he had to pick up the balloon repairman and take him to fix the balloon so that Mr. Percival and his family can ride in it, which he succeeded in doing. So all in all, this is a good episode. Not perfect, but it's still better than Duncan Drops a Clanger, which drives me insane because of the loud bell clanging all the way throughout the episode. Number 4. Duncan and the Old Mine. In my opinion, when it comes to Duncan episodes in the early hit era, this one will be my favorite of the bunch. This episode is about Duncan wanting to go on an adventure instead of having to do work. So he gets himself trapped in an old abandoned coal mine. He thought he would get stuck in there forever until he came across some freight cars that were loaded with coal, and delivered it all the way to the transfer yards on time. Now I know Duncan is a bit out of character in these episodes, but in all honesty, I didn't mind him being adventurous, not to mention a bit cheeky and helpful at times. It just shows that he's not always a rude, bossy, and grumpy little tank engine as I stated before. That's one thing I like about this episode. The second reason is that it does feel like an adventure in my opinion. Oh, and I thought the message at the end was pretty good. Mr. Percival said it best that adventure can be full of surprises whether they're good or bad, and not to mention that Duncan learned to think clearly after escaping the old coal mine. So all in all, this is my favorite episode from the new Marqel era because of these reasons alone. Coming at number 3 is The Runaway Elephant. This one is probably the best Season 7 episode regarding Duncan because it's kind of an exciting one. I like the part where Duncan goes out of control while trying to deliver the elephant statue to the park. And when he crashed into the station, the statue flew high into the air, because that's how physics work, and landed into the lake. Even though it was a mistake, and Duncan was scolded for it afterwards, everyone at the elephant park was happy for his mistake, which is fair, I guess. Yeah, this episode has its flaws, and it's not just with the elephant statue flying into the air like it's light, but also because of the vocal performances provided by Michael Brandon, particularly Duncan's driver. I mean, it starts off with a deep and goofy voice, but then it turns into a high-pitched nasally, "Look out!" when they were about to hit a blue Ford tractor at the level crossing. And I was like, I'm acting! But aside from those faults, this is probably my favorite Duncan episode in the Golan Entertainment era because I did like the runaway sequence, as well as Michael Brandon's performance as Duncan for the most part. I'd give it a watch because it's kind of so bad it's good in a way. Coming at number 2 is Rock and Roll. Out of all the Season 4 episodes starring Duncan, this one is my most favorite of them all. This episode is a follow-up to Duncan's debut episode, Home at Last, where he gets stuck in the tunnel. Here, Rusty warns Duncan about the quote-unquote bad bit of rail, which Duncan ignores. But when he got to the bad track, that's when he derailed, and Rusty and the passengers had to go help rescue him. Thankfully, everyone managed to get him back onto the rails, and in the end, Duncan apologizes to Rusty and suggests that they should be friends, which Rusty agrees. The reason this is number 2 is not only because Season 4 was my most favorite classic season, but because Duncan had learned his lesson about listening to advice and being careful on the track. It just shows his good side rather than his normal grumpy mood. I especially love Duncan's theme as it plays while the character rocks and rolls along the line. I mean, it's such a catchy beat. Before I get to my number 1 pick, here are several honorable mentions. Home at last. It got beat up by rock and roll because Duncan didn't get the whole spotlight in this episode despite it being his debut episode. Still, it's a very nice episode overall. Passengers and Polish. It also would have been number 2 because Duncan was such an ungrateful brat in this episode. Thankfully, he got his comeuppance in the end by Sir Topham Hatt, who was the controller of the railway in the TV series at the time. Faulty Whistle. Let's just say that it's kind of a ripoff of Mike's whistle from the Railway series. Duncan the Humbug. I honestly think it's a pretty good episode, but the reason it didn't make it is because we've seen Christmas Carol tropes too many times in our lives. Besides, it would have been higher on the list. Oh, and speaking of higher on the list, the number 1 spot goes to Duncan and the Grumpy Passenger. When it comes to Duncan episodes in the CGI series, this one deserves the number 1 spot for a very specific reason. This episode is about Duncan trying his very best to please a grumpy passenger, but to no avail. Soon his troubles get worse when he made everyone grumpy for making the trains late, as well as stealing Scarlet's coaches from last night. Later in the end, Duncan apologizes to Mr. Percival for being late and tells him all about the grumpy passenger. Mr. Percival assures him that he's always grumpy and always finds something to complain about, but he has to do his job properly for the next time, which Duncan thankfully does in the very end. This is the reason why this episode is number 1, because not only is it a great message, but in real life, I had to deal with a few angry customers every now and again when I used to work at a couple grocery stores in my life, which I did not enjoy. But still, as this episode suggests, you can't please everyone, and the best way to deal with grumpy people is to be kind to them and do your job no matter what. And I think that's a great message for kids. Now let me know in the comment section below on which of these Duncan episodes are your favorite. Do you agree with my list, or do you have your own personal preference? Join me next time when I do a mini review of the Sharon Miller episode, The Early Bird, and why I think it overall sucks. This is Trevor Davis, signing off.